Hey everyone, RFK Jr. is pushing back against the trans insanity.
So-called gender-affirming care has inflicted lasting physical and psychological damage on vulnerable young people. This is not medicine, it is malpractice. We're done with junk science driven by ideological pursuits, not the well-being of children. This morning, I signed a declaration. Sex-rejecting procedures are neither safe nor effective treatment for children with gender dysphoria.
I'm Rich Lowry of National Review, and I'm the first to admit that RFK Jr. sometimes does not have the facts on his side. He comes up with wild and unsubstantiated theories, but in this case, he is following the most rigorous research, the sort of aggressive medical interventions that have become increasingly the norm in treating kids with gender dysphoria over the last several years is based on a bogus and ideological driven so-called scientific consensus. And as part of its regulatory actions, trying to get the medical establishment into a better place on this issue, HHS issued a review of the evidence that demolishes this so-called consensus. It is called, not very excitingly, Treatment for Pediatric Gender Dysphoria, Review of Evidence and Best Practices. And I know what you're thinking. If you're on the left out there or RFK skeptic, you're thinking, oh, this is some wild project that RFK has come up with. That's some weird outlier. No, Sweden, Finland, and the UK undertook similar reviews of the evidence and came to similar conclusions. Or you might be thinking, this is just partisan hackery. Again, no. A couple of the co-authors wrote a piece for Newsweek titled Liberals Should Read the HHS Review of Pediatric Gender Affirming Care. In it, they write, it is worth noting that we, along with most of the other authors, are liberals. Now, the seedbed for the mania for aggressive medical treatments of children with gender dysphoria was a couple of Dutch studies from years ago that were desperately flawed. Now, in explaining in some detail how that was so, I'm going to rely on a seminal journal article called The Myth of Reliable Research in Pediatric Gender Medicine, a critical evaluation of the Dutch studies and research that has followed. So basically what happened here is Dutch clinicians realized that when they performed so-called sex reassignment surgery on adults, it wasn't having the psychological outcomes that they hoped for. So they wondered, maybe the problem here is that we need to perform these surgeries earlier when these patients are much younger. And these studies supposedly showed positive outcomes, but all sorts of problems here. One, the sample size was extremely small, at most 55 people, and only 32 of these cases actually had all the information you'd want to know about them. So we're talking about studies involving 36 cases, no control group. The way that the cases were selected skewed towards positive outcomes because people were having negative outcomes were discarded along the way. And also the means they used to determine whether the gender dysphoria had been resolved in a positive way was also skewed towards producing positive results. All the physical downsides entirely discounted: infertility, inability to experience sexual pleasure, all that didn't count with regard to these studies. And then there was no way to distinguish whether the purported psychological positive outcomes were a product of the aggressive medical interventions or a product of the psychotherapy that these patients were getting at the same time, or were simply a product of growing older and getting more mature. And then this was a really key thing. The Dutch clinicians, they wanted stable cases. They wanted people who had experienced gender dysphoria from the time they were toddlers. When they were toddlers, they thought they were the wrong gender and also had no other psychological maladies. None of that. So the problem with this is the wave, the epidemic of gender dysphoria we've experienced over the last decade has overwhelmingly involved people who've had so-called rapid onset gender dysphoria at the time that they're having puberty or just after. So these aren't stable cases. And also overwhelmingly, these people have other psychological maladies. So even if you think the Dutch studies are the gold standard, they don't apply to this population. They deliberately excluded this population. But despite all these obvious flaws, this Dutch research was the basis of advanced countries around the Western world deciding all this had to be medicalized. You needed these really aggressive medical interventions involving puberty blockers, hormone therapies, even surgery performed on minors because of what the Dutch said. What occurred is what the authors of the debunking journal article I mentioned a couple minutes ago call runaway diffusion, the phenomenon whereby the medical community mistakes a small innovative experiment as a proven practice and a potentially non-beneficial or harmful practice, quote, escapes the lab, rapidly spreading into general clinical settings. They go on to say, quote, affirmative treatment with hormones and surgery rapidly entered general clinical practice worldwide without the necessary rigorous clinical research to confirm the hypothesized robust and lasting psychological benefits of the practice. Nor was it ever demonstrated that the benefits were substantial enough to outweigh the burden of lifelong dependence on medical interventions, infertility and sterility, and various physical health risks. The studies also failed to quantify the risk of false positives, that is, those gender dysphoric youth whose distress would have been remitted with time without resorting to irreversible medical and surgical interventions. Now, this dynamic, this diffusion built on itself based on politics and ideology. It was assumed that aggressive medical interventions were instruments of compassion and of justice, and all contrary indications, all contrary evidence had to be dismissed as the work of reactionaries and haters. This is how the science came to be so-called settled on such a thin foundation, and settled not coincidentally in exactly the way that trans activists, that crusading clinicians, and progressive politicians wanted. Now, what's been happening in recent years is that the evidence has finally caught up to this craze. And it began in Finland, of all places. The Finns look at the so-called Dutch protocol and they realize, the evidence behind this is kind of thin, and actually it may be harming children. Finland revises its guidelines in 2020. Sweden then follows suit, then Denmark, then Norway. These places aren't red states full of alleged transphobes, right? These are Scandinavian countries associated with really adventurous, progressive policies that they have been more clear-eyed about this phenomenon and the state of the evidence than the United States has is a surprise and a scandal. Then we get the so-called Cass review in the UK in 2024. The Cass report concluded we don't have good evidence about the long-term consequences of these medical interventions to treat gender dysphoria. Now you add this all up and it points to the common sense idea that we should not, as a matter of course, be undertaking aggressive, irreparable medical intervention on minors. Instead, the more prudent approach, the more cautious approach would be watchful waiting, talk therapy, other forms of support, and then when they are adults, if this hasn't resolved, well, then they are more mature and better suited to undertake potentially life-changing medical decisions. So all HHS and Bobby Kennedy are trying to do is to get the United States in line with this more prudent approach that has now become the norm in other Western countries. Of course, this, though, is engendering massive, fierce resistance on the part of the other side. 19 blue states in the District of Columbia are suing to maintain the status quo when it comes to these kind of treatments. Here, again, Bobby Kennedy, he's not always right about the facts or the evidence, but here he is the one following the most rigorous research and the best science. I'm Rich Lowry, over and out.